Okay, we've moved to a different treatment in the same rep that we were looking at earlier, and in this treatment we were using AI nozzles, and we have a little different result here. We have this test replicated, and these are not the concrete results. We'll have to put all our data together, but I think it's obvious that we got a little bit more movement out of the plot area with this nozzle in this rep. Another thing you might notice in the plot is we got a little better coverage, and there are fewer weeds that came through the application. So generally, when we get larger droplets, they're less likely to move, but sometimes the coverage on the target weed is not as good, and we may have to understand that a little better with the technology. But what we're looking at with this nozzle in this treatment, immediately adjacent to the plot, I would have to rate these beans at 50 to 60% injury when you compare them to the beans that didn't receive any off-target movement of the MON 76754 that we were using in this plot. They're about half as tall, and the canopy is not nearly as wide as the beans that didn't get the application. Some of that may be due to the nozzle effect. Some of it could be due to we had a little bit different wind in this plot, and that's why we do several of these things, so we can put that data all together and understand it better. We're at 11 rows out from the area where we tested our AI nozzles, and this is the area where I felt like we were at about 25% leaf injury. You can see that these beans may be regrowing a little bit better than some others where I rated the leaf injury at 25%, but I think it's fairly obvious without removing the canopy that there are strong symptoms where the dicamba caused that cupping symptom that we refer to as epinasty. So in about 11 rows with this nozzle in this test is about where we're at the 25% injury symptom on leaves, and we have probably that 20% reduction in height here. And actually these beans are not really affected laterally like some of the beans we saw in the other plot. It may have something to do with how the particles settled in when they moved off of the plot, but they're about as wide as a lot of the other beans we see looking up and down the row, but they're not hardly as tall. It is fairly obvious in this plot. You're good. We're at an area in the field where we were looking for about 15% injury, and where we found that moving perpendicular from these AI nozzles was at about 20 rows. And the 15% injury symptom, I don't put my hands on the canopy. I can see the injury down in the canopy. It's pretty much recovered on height and growth laterally in this spot. So with this AI nozzle, the movement has been a little bit more. Like I say, part of that may be due to the nozzle and the droplet size. Part of it may be that we had a little bit different wind, and we'll assess all that when we look at this data. We've moved out to 47 rows away from the area where we made the direct herbicide application to get to the point where we thought we had something that was in the neighborhood of 5% injury range. And again, when you get to the 5% level, we have these soybeans pulled apart, and you can see the injury symptoms on the leaves fairly clearly. But when you walk down the row, it's difficult to see this because the beans have recovered. The row is as tall as the area where there was no application, and there's no effect on the canopy laterally speaking. So even though you can see that in this picture and you might think it's fairly clear, if the beans are normally growing, that's an injury symptom there that would be pretty difficult to recognize at this point in the growing season in this plot. So we're 47 rows out, about 5% injury. Okay, we've moved out 53 rows from the point where we made the direct application, and it's easy for me to see that the soybeans here, when you look out across the field for 200 yards or so, there's no difference in the size of these beans in any any of their architecture, whether it be height or the width in the row, and we're to the point where I would pretty much call this zero symptoms. So with our AI nozzles in this plot, we had a little more movement. I think generally speaking, if I'm correct, the AI nozzles tend to make a little smaller droplet, and that's what we would expect. I don't know if it would be exactly the same relationship as these two plots in every test, because the wind speed might have varied, but certainly it makes a little smaller droplet. We got a little more movement. That's what we expected. We're at a point 53 rows from the area where we made the direct application with the AI nozzle here at Kaiser, and this is the point where we felt like we had zero injury symptoms. The height has not been affected. It's the same, as you can see, all of the untreated area in height and the width of the row or the canopy development. So, in this test, we feel like 53 rows is about where it goes to zero in injury symptoms.